About 5 years ago, the issue of black folks in Israel came up in the US media. Very, very rare. It's almost never, ever discussed. But finally someone brought it up. Who was that guy? This guy, then the owner of NBA basketball team. And what he said was, you go to Israel, the blacks are just treated like dogs, is what he said. Well, strangely, it wasn't examined. There was no follow-up. The American media didn't probe that and try to understand, well, is it true? Is it untrue? How could it be true? And so I'm going to do that for you. Let's peel back the layers and look, first of all, at that subset of black folks in Israel, because there's many different black folks, different groups of black folks in Israel, but the one that maybe he could have been first referring to are basketball players. There are, in fact, in the different Israeli basketball leagues, the different teams that have black players, and this is how they are referred to in that society. Here is Oded Tira, who was nominated the first sports commissioner of Israel. And on his first day in office as Israeli sports commissioner, he says, well, there are those who didn't like that you played with 5 N-word for much of the championship game. That's day one. I wouldn't say that this is beyond the pale for Israeli society. Far from it. You have the mayor of Holon, which is a suburb of Tel Aviv, Moti Sasson, and he says, I don't want to see foreigners. If you want to see the N-word, there's the NBA. So this is the mayor of a Tel Aviv suburb. This is the sports commissioner. This is obviously, not in the back alleys this is not in the pubs and the clubs. This is straight up from, high-level officials, and it's disconcerting to say the least. And the truth is, it's not only in secular society, it's also in religious society. So, in Christianity or in Catholicism, there's a pope. In Judea, in the Jewish world, I'm sure you've heard the expression, 2 Jews, 3 opinions. You can hardly get any group of Jews to agree on any one thing, certainly not on issues of religion. And so in the state of Israel, for example, and in other communities, there are actually 2 chief rabbis, not 1. And so these are Israel's 2 chief rabbis. Pope comes to Israel, meets with the 2 chief rabbis, so I'll go through them one by one. This is David Lau, the chief Ashkenazi rabbi. And once again, on literally his first day in office, after being named chief rabbi of Israel, he says, what do you care if the N-word that get paid by Tel Aviv beat the N-word that get paid by Greece? He was frustrated that some religious youth were watching basketball, being interested in sports instead of studying Torah all day. So he says, what do you care? And this is his way of putting them down. That's the Ashkenazi chief rabbi. Then we move to the Sephardi chief rabbi. And once again, I should say that in both of those cases, these are chief rabbis, the sons of chief rabbis. Their fathers were chief rabbis before them. So these are dynasties. These are not one-offs, And so when Yitzchak Yosef becomes the chief rabbi of Israel, he says, among other things, if you see a Negro, you bless God for altering creation. Which Negro do you bless? It must be a Negro whose father and mother are white, if you know their child turned out like that, a monkey. Okay. I personally was shocked, scandalized that he would say such a thing. I wasn't the only one. Some people called him on it, questioned him. In response, what did he say? What did his office put out a statement? Well, the words of the rabbi are quoted from the Babylonian Talmud. Don't come to me with a complaint, go to the Talmud. And then they go on to say, if one sees a Negro, an elephant, or an ape, one says, blessed is he who makes strange creatures. So unfortunately, we can't identify this as only the product of the secular society and the traditions that create it. It's also among the religious stream. And when he says, this is part of our tradition, this is part of our Talmud, he's not lying in a sense, because in Jewish tradition, how do you determine what is Jewish law? I've already told you that, 2 Jews, 3 opinions. How can you even decide what is Jewish law and what isn't? And the way that Orthodox Jews, in any case, the way that Orthodox Jews or literalists determine what is Jewish law is they refer to Maimonides. This is the man who is on the one shekel bill, when there was one. There's no now we've gone down to coins, but when there was a one shekel bill, it was the visage of Maimonides. And of Maimonides, the tradition says that from Moses of the Bible to Moses Maimonides, there were none greater than Moses Maimonides. This is a Jewish saying, and what it means is that since the lawgiver, Moses of the Bible, the most holy messenger of God is Maimonides, and so therefore he is the arbiter of what is Jewish law and what isn't. What he says goes. His texts are the authoritative ones. So what does Moses Maimonides say about black folks? And he's writing about 1,000 years ago, right? A millennium ago. And he says, Negroes and the nomads in the South and those who resemble them in our climates, their nature is like the nature of mute animals. They are not on the level of human beings, he says. Their level among existing things is below that of a man and above that of a monkey. So, okay, clearly we've got a big problem here, and it's deeply rooted. And so, how do we enter modern times and black folks even being understood as something separate, as a race apart, as you said, Jesse, understood as non-human, subhuman, alien? How do we get to that? And of course, it goes without saying that slavery, the institution of slavery, transatlantic slavery, was the prime engine by which we have a situation in which black folks are considered subhuman in our recent history. But like I said, slavery is the institution that made this racism possible, but the racism existed beforehand. The problem is that if in Jewish law there was no slavery, then no matter how racist you are, you couldn't put people in that category of subhuman, of someone that you could enslave. If all people were equal under biblical law, then there would be no way to enslave anyone. It would be illegal according to your own religion, right? The problem is that, like Christianity and like Islam and all the monotheistic religions, they do allow for slavery, and they have a space for it. And people who practice it are not excommunicated. They are respectable members of society when they practice it. So in the Bible, it says in Leviticus, in chapter 25, it says, of the nations that are all around you, of them you shall buy bondmen and bondmaids. And of the children of the residents that live amongst you, they may be your possession. And you may make them an inheritance for children after you. You may enslave them forever. Okay, so again, this is no different from Christianity or Islam. No one gets off the hook here, but we cannot deny that that's also the case in the Jewish religion. But over your brethren, the children of Israel, you shall not rule over one another ruthlessly. So how do we determine who can be slaves and who can be slaved perpetually? It's if they are not Jews. And then, as I said, Christianity, Islam, equally as culpable, certainly in the transatlantic slave trade. But we cannot deny and sweep under the rug the partial responsibility that the Jewish folks, the Jewish tradition, the Jewish religion has played in the history of transatlantic slave trade. It's very, as you mentioned, Jesse, it's very sensitive, very difficult. We don't want to pour scorn on any one group of people, individually single them out and say you especially, but we can also we must have a Truth and Reconciliation Committee. We must look at the facts dead on and face up to it and account for it and, where possible, make reparations, in my humble view. So, entering the era of transatlantic slavery, we'll start in the South Americas and work our way up. So, in South America, there was actually a town called Yoden Savan, where Jewish folks were actually large percentage of that settlement and established synagogues in South America. And when they did so, established their agricultural communities there, they fully participated in the slave trade to the point where they would, if those so-called slaves that were their possessions fled, if these Africans who had been kidnapped in Africa, brought to South America, enslaved there, then managed to flee their slavery, then Jewish communities would gather together young men to send them out on expeditions to chase down those black folks and re-enslave them. And in fact, they did so. And when they caught up with those slaves, they often exacted incredibly, horrific mutilations and murders upon them in order to send a message to all the other slaves that worked for them to don't even think about doing that yourself. Now, it got to the point where we have records of Jewish synagogues saying, okay, we are now blessing you young men. You young men are now about to go out into the jungles out there and track down these African men and women who've fled slavery. So we are now blessing you. And they actually authored prayers in Hebrew and translated into English. Save and deliver those who are setting out to fight our enemies, the Negroes, cruel and rebellious. Conquer and destroy all cruel and rebellious Africans, our enemies who are planning evil against us. Now, again, this is not any random person. This is not some conspiracy site or anything. This is Cecil Roth, who is a very respected historian. He was educated at Oxford. He was a fellow of the Royal Historical Society. Among other things, he also has a roundabout, like an intersection named after him in Israel. So he's obviously someone who has professional standing, and he's written many books on this topic, including A History of the Marranos, and in which he writes, the Jews of the Yod and Savan were also foremost in the suppression of the successive Negro revolts from 1690 to 1722. Furthermore, he writes, these, as a matter of fact, were largely directed against them as being the greatest slaveholders of the region. This, just to clarify, this was exceptional in most of the places that were settled by Europeans, white folks from the old world. Most of those settlers were Christian. Jews only constituted a minority. In this specific settlement in South America, they were the majority. But we can't ignore the fact that they were the largest ethnic group in that community, and therefore they were also the largest slaveholders in the region. So we move to Simon Wolf. Simon Wolf was past president of B'nai B'rith, one of the oldest, if not the oldest continuing existing Jewish organization in the United States. He was also the consul general of the United States to Egypt. So he had political standing in the Jewish community and political standing in the American government. And he was a lawyer. And Simon Wolf also, here he is this is the American consulate in Egypt back in the day. So he's writing 100 years ago, and he writes the book, The American Jew as Patriot, Soldier, and Citizen. And in his book, he documents this sad, sick history that I just outlaid for you, which he writes, talking about one of those groups of Jewish soldiers who went out into the jungles of South America to recapture escaped slaves. He writes, the company returned, bringing with them the trophies, namely 6 hands severed from fallen Negroes. This is not the most horrific of the descriptions, but I thought it would be enough to leave it at that. Another historian who's documented some of this sad history is Bertram Corn. He was the senior rabbi at Congregation Knesset Israel in Philadelphia. He was also the first Jewish chaplain to receive flag rank in the U.S. Armed Forces, and he was actually buried at Arlington Cemetery. So, again, a very establishment voice. We don't have to go into some kind of back channel to find this information. It's all there in the record. And Bertram Corn, he wrote a book, Jews and Negro Slavery in the Old South. And he relates to this issue. He talks about any Jew who could afford to own slaves and had need for their services would do so. What he says is that there is no iota of evidence that these Jews gave support to the slave system out of fear of anti-Jewish prejudice. So, we've also sometimes hear this claim from folks who would impugn Jewish people. They say, oh, you're overly represented amongst slaveholders. Jews were slaves more than other white Christian folks were slaves. And from my analysis, at least, of the historical record, that is incorrect. Jews were not more active in the slave trade, but they were also no less active in the slave trade. What Corn says and what others have said is that Jewish white folks participated in the slave trade in as much as they could. If their economic situation allowed them to, then they participated in the slave trade at the same percentage, or the same ratio as the Christian settler population of America participated in the slave trade, no more and no less on average. So while maybe we don't have a worse record than Christian folks, that's setting the bar extremely low because, as we well know, white Christian folks are incredibly complicit, enormously complicit in the history of slavery. So it's important that we acknowledge this, for better and for worse. It's not only bad stories. We also have good stories to tell. There's the story of folks like August Bondi. This man, he born in Vienna, Austria, part of the struggle, the pro-democracy struggles against the emperors at that time that ruled Austria, fled once he realized that, despite their best efforts, they weren't going to topple the monarchy at that time, moves to the United States, immigrates here, and very quickly finds himself the subject of, basically pitted at the crux of white, black slavery, anti-slavery, the struggle, when he moves to Kansas and he starts up his homestead, and then he comes under, finds himself at the front lines of attacks between pro-slavery, anti-slavery forces. John Brown quickly becomes an ally. He joins John Brown's forces and fights with him at the Battle of Blackjack, which, for Civil War historians, this is what some would say is like the prelude to the Civil War. These are the first shots of the Civil War, the first efforts, at least by white folks in any numbers, to put their bodies on their line and stand up and be counted in the struggle to abolish slavery, not only in words only, but in actions as well. So actually, his history, most folks may not know of this, but it has been documented. His autobiography is recorded in Congress and also has been translated into Yiddish. So it's out there for all who are interested. But to be fair, he was an exception. This wasn't like masses of people joining the abolition movement at the time. The group, the American Anti-Slavery Society, published a report in the run-up to the Civil War, and they said, the Jews of the U.S. have never taken any steps whatever with regard to the slavery question. And they're talking now about the organized Jewish community, such as it was. It wasn't very organized, it was still small, but such as it was, let's say the 200 or so Jewish synagogues that existed at that time in the U.S., communal organizations did not step into the fray, did not make a statement one way or another. And they go on to say, objects of oppression as the Jews have been for ages, surely they, more than any other denomination, ought to. We would hope. Sadly, that wasn't the case. The historical record shows that they sat on the sidelines as a community. Of course, there were exceptions, but as a community. So, and we see this when we look to those synagogues that I described. So here's Beth Shalom. This is the first synagogue in Richmond, Virginia, which is, I guess, at that time was a slave state. So in their internal writings, when they have codes of who can become a member of the synagogue and who can't become a member, they say that only free men may become a member of the synagogue, and that way they restricted the membership only to white folks in that synagogue. Other synagogue like Bet Elohim of Charleston, South Carolina, they weren't as explicit. There's all kinds of ways that we can say the same thing without being explicit about it. So what they said was, and this is, considered at that time the most liberal of all U.S. synagogues. So we're looking at the leftist, the furthest left part on the spectrum. And in their 1920 Constitution, they wrote that, he, she, or they are not people of color. So they were straight up explicit. We don't have to talk about slavery, non-slavery. No, straight up, it's no black folks allowed. That's the record. Now, in terms of the rabbis, I'm sad to say that for the most part, almost fully, when they did speak up, if they did speak up, it was in favor of slavery. So we have Maximilian Michelbacher. He was the first rabbi of Beth Shalom synagogue, also in Richmond, Virginia. This synagogue, it hosted the first Jewish school in Richmond, and it actually housed the first school altogether in Richmond. There was no school for kids in Richmond until this synagogue. So obviously they played a pivotal role in the community, Jewish or otherwise. In 1863, he read a sermon on what was called the Confederate Day of Prayer, that was called, to ramp up support for the Confederate States. And this is what he had to say in his prayer that was then published. They then found funds to actually publish this, and so that it would go wider than just his synagogue, but be distributed, disseminated throughout the country. He writes, "The manservants and the maidservants thou hast given unto us, that we may bear rule over them. They incite our now he's talking about the North, right? The abolitionists. They incite our manservants and maidservants to insurrection, to assassinate and to slay the men and women and children, cause them to fall into destruction, which is their evil intents. They digged for us, our wives and our children." It takes a lot of chutzpah to shift it, to flip the script and say it's the black folks who are the vicious, cruel ones, and we, our wives and our children are victims here. And anyways, this is the kind of rhetoric that the Confederate States, of course, like President Jefferson Davis, sought to augment these voices, and they recommended that this be published, and given. But he wasn't the only one. He was far from it. This is Bernard Levy. At that time, this is an Orthodox synagogue. At that time, most of the synagogues in America, still today, are not Orthodox. They're Reform or Conservative or other more liberal movements of Judaism. But this is kind of considered the most respected Orthodox rabbi at the time. And came from a long line of Orthodox rabbis. He's at least, at this point, there's maybe 4 Orthodox rabbis in the whole country. And he was the rabbi of the Baltimore Hebrew congregation, or the Lloyd Street Shul. And in 1861, he gave this speech. And this is what he had to say, weighing in on the issue of slavery from a Bible perspective. He says, "Why did not Moses prohibit the buying or selling of slaves? Was there ever a greater philanthropist than Abraham? And why did he not set free the slaves? Who can blame our brethren of the South? The government will not protect the property rights." So this is his missive to support the state propaganda, so pro-slavery propaganda. And in fact, he was so lauded for this speech that he gave that afterwards he was offered a post at another synagogue, a synagogue in New Orleans. It was like, "Wow, if you gave that speech, we'd love to have you as our rabbi." And then he moved down to New Orleans and took up that post there. This is Shanghai Knesset Synagogue in New Orleans. So moving back to the north, because I don't want you to think this is only in the southern states, and this is something that clearly in the north they were much more enlightened. No, let's put aside that. No, it's far from the case. This is Morris Jacob Raphael. He was the rabbi of Bnei Yeshurun Synagogue in New York City. At the time, he was the highest paid clergyman in the entire U.S. Jewish, Christian, Muslim, or whatever other religion, he was the most highly paid preacher. And he was also, in history, the first rabbi to give opening prayer at a session of Congress. So in 1861, again, on the eve of the Civil War, he gives this speech called The Bible View of Slavery. And it was so popular, that he had to repeat it, that they actually, like I said, produced a pamphlet of it. And this was distributed. This is what he writes there. He writes, "Throughout the world, the unfortunate Negro is indeed the meanest of slaves. Much has been said respecting the inferiority of his intellectual powers. No man of his race has ever inscribed his name on the pantheon of human excellence, either mental or moral. In the face of protection afforded in the Ten Commandments, how dare you denounce slaveholding as a sin? You are guilty of something very little short of blasphemy. You see, this is I mean, of course, by today's standards, it's unfathomably, it's sick, it's disgusting to actually say that, to suggest that slavery is wrong is blasphemous. This is how far gone. But as I said, he was the most highly paid clergyman in the U.S. at the time, and these words were published, paid to be published throughout the country. Now, as I said, he was not the only. This was not the only voice. There were dissenting voices. Even though this was the majority of Jewish rabbinical voices at the time, there were exceptions. Like August Bondi, there was David Einhorn. David Einhorn was certainly the only Southern rabbi who dissented from the pro-slavery position. He was the first rabbi of the first synagogue in the United States that was reformed from the start. That didn't start as Orthodox and then gradually adopt Reform Judaism. This is first Reform from the start, so very deeply rooted in the Reform tradition. He also, this is his synagogue, the Har Sinai congregation in Baltimore. He was pivotal, as I said, in the Reform movement. He wrote the prayer book that became the basis for the Reform movement's first published prayer book, for Siddur. And in 1861, responding to that Rabbi Raphael that I just mentioned, so he does a responsa, in which he does a contra. He says, the Jewish religious press must raise objections to this if it does not want Judaism branded forever, he says in response to that. When he came out opposed to slavery and called upon the Jewish community to reject slavery, he paid for it practically with a pogrom. There were riots in Baltimore. It wasn't only about him. Let's not pretend that he was the sole instigator of that. But when riots broke out in Baltimore on the eve of the Civil War, you had, pro-slavery forces working their way through the cities, mobbing, destroying folks that they knew to be involved or were suspected of being involved in abolitionist forces. They attacked people, killed people, and certainly sacked his home. He was saved, his life was saved by, folks who realized what was coming, and, as the mob approached, they whisked him away, him and his family, and they fled town. They fled to Philadelphia. But as I said, his home was, destroyed. People broke in and would have done the same to him if he'd been there. He then found, a synagogue in Philadelphia and spent the rest of his days there. But this is the legacy that we're left with.
Atlanta's really lucky to have you here and doing this work, which we talk about difficult dialogues. This is one, and critiquing one's own home community and raising really difficult questions. A lot of times, most of the time, people will say horrible things about a truth teller in your position, which usually is an indication you're doing the right thing, but it also is very hard work to do. And I know that people do this work to improve one's community, not to destroy it, but people always take it the other way around. I believe you have to truly love your own community to ask the difficult questions of one's own community. Otherwise, we just leave it and say, you're on your own, good luck.